أشكر الدكتور زكريا سلطان على هذه المعلومات القيمة التي قدم والطروحات والتوجهات التي تناولت حلولا وأفكارا تديرنا إلى إمكانية إيجاد حلول سليمة. والآن الكلمة مستر مايسون هو المسؤول في الإدارة الإخوانية للحكومة الإيطالية.
Good morning. My primary role as an actuary in the UK Government Actuaries Department is to advise the managers of occupational pension schemes on their developing financial position. For many years now, the UK Government has been increasing the involvement of the private sector in the provision of public services, and a major part of my role is to advise government departments on how the pension benefits for employees who are transferred to the private sector should be protected. My aim this morning is to introduce the conference to some of the practical issues that might need to be addressed as policies are introduced that increase the likelihood of citizens in this region changing employer more frequently than present. I shall be covering the following main subject areas. First, I shall outline the main objectives of preservation and transfers. Second, I shall discuss possible practical approaches to treatment of members who wish to transfer their benefits out of the pension or social insurance scheme when they voluntarily leave the job. Third, I shall address the different considerations that might apply to members who are compelled to change employer when their job is moved from the government to the private sector. And fourth, I shall highlight the importance of communicating any social insurance benefit changes to members early in the privatisation process. Our experience in the UK shows that such communication is usually essential if transferring employees is to remain motivated, a key element of successful privatisation. Let me set the scene first of all by briefly describing a typical Gulf country social insurance scheme. The main risks covered are old age, permanent disability, death and employment injury. The scheme offers defined benefits, that is, the benefits provided are calculated according to a set of rules. The old age pension will generally be calculated by reference to the member's length of service and to his or her pay at the time of retirement. Such schemes are funded so that benefits are paid from the scheme's assets, which are built up from a combination of employer, employee, and possibly government contributions. So what are the objectives of preservation and transfers? Well, if the social insurance benefits available when an employee resigns from service are worth significantly less than the value of the old age benefits that he or she might have otherwise received, then the employee may decide not to leave the job. Whilst this approach may benefit an employer who is anxious to keep staff turnover to a minimum, the result is that the barrier is created to job mobility, which is likely to reduce the efficiency of an economy's recruitment market. One main objective of offering employees the option to preserve or transfer their social insurance rights might therefore be to produce a more flexible labour market. One approach could be to offer the employee an immediate cash benefit on leaving of equivalent value to social insurance benefits given up. However, many employees would be unlikely to set the money aside to provide for their old age, death or disability, so this approach might actually defeat one of the primary aims of social insurance provision. Further, the employee might also be left destitute later in life and would therefore ultimately end up relying on government support, which would increase the cost of provision overall. Furthermore, if the cash sums fairly reflected the value of the benefits given up, then the payments would probably be sufficiently large to actually encourage employees to switch jobs frequently, again distorting the recruitment market. An alternative approach would be to introduce an element of portability into social insurance provision, whereby employees would either move their benefits from job to job or preserve them within their employer's scheme. A helpful starting point to decide on an appropriate level of preserved benefit is to consider the rate at which members' benefits accrue during their careers. For example, if an employee were entitled to an old age pension of 1/2 of their final pay after 30 years' service, Then, if they left after 15 years service, they could be awarded a reserve pension of 1/4 of their pay at leaving, payable from some defined old age retirement age. However, in an inflationary environment, it would be necessary to increase the benefits to be leaving in retirement to ensure that they maintain their real value. Of course, to fully maintain the value of benefits, they would need to be linked to the members' pay, but as this would be outside the control of the original employer, this is not a risk that many schemes would feel able to accept. An alternative would be to link the pension to an index of general price or wage inflation. As an alternative to benefits, members might instead be offered transfer value. This would need to be payable to another social insurance arrangement, as otherwise it would effectively become the cash benefit I referred to earlier. It would also be necessary to consider the extent to which transfers between social insurance arrangements should actually be regulated. The overall aim of offering reserve benefits or transfer values should be to treat both members and schemes financially fairly. That is, that neither party should make excessive profit or loss from the member's decision to change employer. Where countries within the region offer similar social insurance schemes, then it might be possible for international agreements to be reached, allowing for the cross-border transfer of pension rights. For schemes which currently offer low end of service benefits, there would clearly be additional costs that reserve benefits or transfer values were offered in the future. However, these costs might be considerably offset by the savings that would flow from a more efficient recruitment market. I'd like to turn to some of the practical issues that arise when you decide how to actually calculate a transfer amount. One approach is to calculate the fair value of the reserve benefits that might otherwise have been awarded. You need actuarial input at this stage to produce transfer value factors. Assumptions will be required for demographic factors, for example, mortality and possibly disability rates, and for financial factors, for example, the assumed rates of investment return, and salary or price inflation. The scheme's managers will also need to decide on what we mean by fair. Should the transfer amount be reasonably certain to provide benefits given up, or be expected to have an even chance of providing them? As mentioned earlier, if the payment is to be used to provide social insurance benefits, the scheme will need to ensure that the transfer amount is not abused. The scheme might list in its rules those arrangements, both national and international, to which transfer value could be paid. Alternatively, payment might be made for personal social insurance products where these are available. The scheme's managers should also consider the possibility that the transfer value might be used by members to select against the scheme. For example, a member who is terminally ill might calculate that his dependents would be better off if he took a transfer amount to a personal arrangement rather than the benefit from the employer's scheme. The financial risks to a scheme of such behaviour can, to an extent, be reduced by making allowance for the actuarial assumptions used to calculate the transfer value, and also by possibly considering wider changes to the scheme's benefit structure. It's likely the scheme is willing to pay outgoing transfer values to members who leave service, and also be willing to accept incoming payments from new recruits. There are three main methods that can be used to provide benefits in respect to such incoming transfers. Firstly, the scheme can simply award the incoming member a service credit calculated using similar assumptions used for those for outgoing transfers. The scheme would then be accepting the financial risk that the payment was insufficient to meet the value of the benefits transferred across. The most significant elements are likely to be salary increases, as the seeding scheme is unlikely to have allowed salary increases due to promotion in their calculation. The incoming service credit could be reduced to allow for this. To remove the salary increase risk altogether, the receiving scheme might instead offer a fixed benefit that is not related to the member's pay. The final option would be not to offer a defined benefit at all, but a money purchase or defined contribution benefit instead. The transfer could be invested, and when the member came to make a claim, the accumulated value of life benefits. This approach, however, places all financial risks with the member. In a situation where there are relatively few schemes, then the employers and managers might agree that actuarial decisions are not required, and that in the interest of a flexible labour market, a simpler approach would be adopted. Transfer payments could be made between the schemes using a single set of factors, and members would be offered year-to-year service credits, although these might need to be adjusted to allow the differences between the scheme's benefit structures. This approach would be particularly suitable when schemes expect to transfer value payments to be broadly equal to receipts, reducing the need for actuarial precision to be applied to the calculation of transfer amounts. So far, I've discussed possible approaches to introducing portability of pensions when members leave service voluntarily. Pensions portability of this kind is likely to improve job mobility. However, when members are actually compelled to change employers due to privatisation, then different considerations apply. Under privatisation, the change of employer is not at the employee's choice. The success of privatisation will require a motivated workforce. The governments may therefore decide that it is desirable that employee social insurance arrangements should be broadly unaffected by a compulsory change of employer. If so, a separate consideration will need to be given to benefits in respect of service following a transfer and accrued benefits earned up until the date of a transfer. Turning first to those benefits and issues that might be considered in respect of future service. Well, government social insurance arrangements are usually more generous than those available in the private sector, and employees are very likely to argue for protection in such cases. How might benefits be protected? Well, the first obvious option might be to offer continued membership to the government scheme. This is likely to be popular with transferring employees who will be reassured that their benefit provision is seamless. However, the government would be backing a liability which relates to salaries that it no longer controls. There's considerable scope for the system to be abused by employers, for example by awarding employees very high pay rises shortly before retirement to boost old age pensions. The government could insist that it retain control over pay, but it is unlikely that the private sector employer would be happy to operate within this constraint. One solution might be for the government to restrict increases in pay that account for social insurance purposes, leaving the new employer flexibility to award additional non-insurable increases, although this might be unpopular with the employees. It might also be difficult to set an appropriate level of contributions for the new employer. The appropriate contribution rate will depend upon the age, sex and salary profile of the transferring employees, and this may be different to that of the government workforce as a whole. There's therefore a trade-off between the desirability of charging each employer an appropriate rate and the administrative problems of having many different employers each contributing at different rates. A second option might be to require new employers to set up a new scheme that replicates the government scheme. However, government schemes are often extremely complex, and it is possible new employers would be reluctant to provide an exact copy. The third option would be to require employers to provide a similar scheme to the government scheme, but not necessarily an exact copy. This provides a framework for employers to provide schemes offering benefits of a similar value and range, but with complexities that may be involved in the government scheme removed. This is the approach adopted in the United Kingdom. In order to satisfy employees that the overall private sector package is not less valuable than the benefits given up, the government could require that the employer's proposals are assessed by an independent third party, for example, a firm of consulting actuaries. Finally, the government could decide that rather than attempting to offer identical or similar arrangements, the employer could be required to offer alternative compensation that is not linked to defined benefit social insurance. For example, members might be offered a pay rise to compensate for the value of benefits lost, or a social insurance top-up into a defined contribution arrangement. Again, it would probably be desirable for an independent third party to assess any alternative arrangements and confirm that they were fair. The next slide looks at issues that need to be considered in respect of members' past service benefits. First, the benefits could be preserved within the government scheme. As I discussed earlier, this might present difficulties over pay control. The government is unlikely to accept a salary-related liability that it cannot control, and transferring employees will be unhappy if their salary link is broken. Alternatively, Alternatively, the benefits transferred to the new scheme could be transferred to the new scheme and a bulk transfer payment made from one scheme to the other. Two alternative approaches here are, first, that separate negotiations take place between each scheme at each privatisation exercise, allowing for the demographic profile and salary expectations of the transferring workforce. Or second, that the government and schemes agree on set factors that can be applied to all privatisation exercises. Whichever approach is adopted, it will be important for the government and private sector employers to be treated equitably. The employer will not want to receive less money than is needed to meet the transferring liabilities, as this will increase its contribution requirements in the future. Similarly, the government is likely to consider an overpayment to be an inappropriate use of funds. As with the assumptions used to calculate a voluntary transfer value, one of the key needs will be for the government and employer to agree on an acceptable level of certainty that the transferring funds will ultimately meet the liabilities. Finally, the members should also be treated equitably. What are the benefits that are to be offered in the new scheme? Where the two benefit structures are identical, then the members could be offered year-to-year service credits. Where the private sector scheme has a less valuable benefit structure, then both the government and transferring employees will want to ensure the benefits of equivalent value to those given up are provided, which might in fact result in members being offered more than 1 year in the new scheme for each year in the old scheme. This slide is used as an example to highlight possible differences between the treatment of benefits for a privatised member and one transferring voluntarily from the government to the private sector. I have assumed that the private sector scheme offers benefits of a similar range and value to the government scheme. Although this may not be the case at present, as discussed earlier, one possible outcome of privatisation exercises might be that the private sector employers offer schemes which more closely mirror government benefits. A member moving voluntarily to the private sector might be offered preserved benefits in respect of the service accrued within the government scheme or a transfer payment to another social insurance scheme. The government is not prepared to link these preserved benefits to pay at retirement. The private sector scheme is willing to offer service credit in respect of this transfer payment. However, because the service credit will be linked to pay at retirement, it will be less than year to year. By contrast, on a compulsory move to the private sector, the government may wish to ensure that members' social insurance benefits are fully protected, so that the transfer payment will allow for future pay increases. The receiver scheme is therefore able to offer year-to-year service credits, and there is no break in the link to pay at retirement. Turning to the fourth main area, I'd like to say a few words on the importance of communication. Firstly, social insurance benefits are complex and often poorly understood. Employees who have been privatised are likely to be confused and apprehensive if the issue is not handled openly. Experience in the United Kingdom has shown that it is helpful to address social insurance issues early in the privatisation process and reassure employees that their benefits will be protected with the new employer. Where it is possible to find a simple method of protecting benefits, then this will be more easily understood and hence appreciated by the employees. There is, however, a difficult balance to achieve between simplicity and fairness to employees, private sector employers, and government. Finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention this morning. It's been a pleasure to speak here, and I will be at the conference until Wednesday afternoon if anybody wants to discuss any of these issues in more detail with me. Thank you.